Russian soldiers are literally freezing to death in Ukraine. With temperatures approaching 0 degrees Fahrenheit, frostbite and hypothermia are taking a real toll on the attacking forces. Now, weather this cold sucks across the board, both in the offense and the defense. But today we've got some comments from a Ukrainian commander talking about how this case of general winter actually benefits Ukraine. This is a note from the Ukrainian 7th Rapid Response Corps, currently fighting in the Pokrovsk, Myrnohrad direction, where they say defensive operations are continuing and note that Russian offensive potential is beginning to degrade. They cite adverse weather conditions combined with a systemic disregard for personnel welfare. They say the decisive factor that mitigates weather effects is troop preparation and equipment. Defending forces benefit from well-prepared, long-term positions equipped with shelters, heating, and stockpiles. This significantly reduces non-combat losses. Supply routes are established, logistics are functioning, and reserves are in place. For troops on the offensive, especially without vehicular resupply, all available equipment is limited to what a soldier can carry: a sleeping mat, a sleeping bag, a blanket, and a small gas stove. Look, I would argue that a small gas stove is probably more than most of these soldiers are carrying forward. Look, the way that Russia has conducted offensive operations for about the last at least 9 months, maybe a year, have been these infiltration tactics. So yes, there are still the occasional large-scale assault. It's generally platoon, maybe company level. But mostly what we're seeing are small groups of Russian infantry dropped off, and they have to advance on foot 5, 10, 20 kilometers to try to get near the line of contact. They then, in small groups, try to infiltrate through the thinly held Ukrainian lines, right? They're largely held with drone screens in most areas of the front, and try to then reestablish their position and get reinforced once they're in the Ukrainian-controlled territory. So these guys are having to walk a day or more sometimes to find some sort of position, right? Usually not well-prepared, well-defended positions. They're holed up in basements. In fact, when we were talking with some of the guys from Azov, they were helping clear the Dopropilia salient a few months ago. They said some of those guys had been in those basements for 4 months. I mean, they're just moving forward and kind of turning that place into a modified home and waiting for reinforcements. Now, that doesn't sound like fun at baseline, but doing that in July, August, September is one thing. Doing that in the middle of January is another, in 0-degree weather. Now, we know that the guys in Dopropilia were reinforced and resupplied, via drones. So they had water and batteries and ammunition flown in, food flown in on one-way attack drones that just crashed, and instead of detonating, had a couple water bottles, things like that. Russia had so many drones, they were using that. What do you do in a cold weather situation, right? Is it more blankets? More sleeping bags? I mean, these guys can't afford to start fires, right? That gives away their position very clearly to the Ukrainian drone operators. So they're having to move forward into blown-out buildings and destroyed basements and just hope for the best. Again, how many of those infantrymen do you think are actually carrying a stove forward? And then if they even do get it there, are they using it? Probably not very many. They say Russian soldiers are pushed into open terrain without proper winter equipment and with no intent to sustain them. They cannot dig into frozen ground or light fires. The result is hypothermia and frostbite, quickly translating into non-combat injuries. In the Pokrovsk sector, Russian forces are attacking in small infantry groups without armor or mechanized support. Ukrainian troops operate from prepared positions, repel repeated assaults, and maintain control over key terrain. In these conditions, the cold works in the favor of the defenders. Again, cold weather sucks across the board, but given the option, I would rather be in the Ukrainian situation here, where they are in some of the same positions, able to resupply, reinforce, rotate their personnel in and out, stay inside, have the heat on, versus the Russians that day in and day out are dismounted, walking across open terrain where they cannot dig in, they cannot start a fire. And then what's the hope, right? Where do these infantry think they're going to get to where there's some warm place in their future? Don't answer that. Actually, I feel like there's a joke to be had, but they're not. It's not like they're going to get past the line of contact and have some tent there where they can warm up. Once these guys dismount these vehicles right now, over the course of the last week here and probably for the next couple weeks, they're going to die. Like if they're not found by a Ukrainian drone, how long are they going to survive out in the elements in 0-degree Fahrenheit? That's minus 15 Celsius. Not long. How much can they actually carry on their back? And again, just surviving in those conditions by itself would be a significant struggle. But you have to remember, these Russian soldiers trying to survive are also being hunted day and night by Ukrainian drones. Now, shifting over to the map here to give you an idea of a couple different areas we're going to talk about in today's video. We did just start in Pokrovsk, and we've got a couple more updates here. I'm actually going to run through some Russian assessments later in today's video to give you their perspective of battlefield updates and the progress, or maybe more specifically, the lack of progress that they have noted in recent weeks. Now, this is the Pokrovsk sector here. When I mentioned Dobropilia a second ago, that's the salient to the north. So in Pokrovsk especially, we're continuing to see kind of a focus of Russian offensive operations. General Syrsky was there a couple days ago, where he said the operational situation in the Pokrovsk direction remains complex. A grueling confrontation is ongoing in this area, nearly 50 combat clashes per day. He says the enemy is trying to increase pressure. It is bringing reinforcements to Pokrovsk and seeking opportunities to break through our defenses, both through sporadic massive assaults and through covert advancement of small infantry groups. And we've seen a little bit of that in recent days. Again, we've already played a bunch of footage of the individual, and every day it comes out, individual infantry soldiers trying to move forward in this direction. But just overnight, we got another video, this one coming from the Ukrainian 46th Airborne Brigade, showing a mechanized assault. First time in a while. Seems like Russia kind of walked back from this, and it's understandable why. I mean, especially now in the snow, Ukraine can see these things coming miles and miles and miles away, and the result is kind of as expected. In this particular case, again, released from the 46th Airborne Brigade, they said they tried to attack using armored vehicles and several dozen infantry. They tried to reach the brigade's position, deploying 4 units of armored vehicles. However, they were repelled. They say during the battle, the paratroopers destroyed 1 enemy tank and 2 enemy armored combat vehicles. In addition, 20 Russians were eliminated and another 3 were wounded. And a note on those that are wounded here, again, going to the factor of the cold weather, if it is so hard, and it is so hard to survive at full strength in 0-degree weather, let's be honest about those 3 Russian soldiers that were wounded in that attack. I mean, unless somebody comes out and gets them right away, they don't stand a chance. They're not going to survive. It's going to be frostbite. It's going to be hypothermia, despite what their wounds are. If they're not fully healthy and able to find some place with shelter and create warmth, even minor wounds in this type of weather condition will prove fatal, possibly by other means. Now, continuing on in the Pokrovsk direction, we do have a fair amount of footage coming out from this fight recently. Deep State Map provided a bit of an update here, saying access to Myrnohrad. In fact, it's going to be good to look at a map for this one. So we've got Myrnohrad just a little bit to the east of Pokrovsk. And notably, this pocket doesn't seem to have collapsed quite yet. This is, again, let's go back to the beginning of the month, right? So it's not good looking there for Ukraine, but we did think that this would try to be sealed off, that Russia would try to close this pocket and encircle the forces in Myrnohrad. Moving to today, that still hasn't happened. Very slow, very, very tepid progress. Deep State Map says access to Myrnohrad is essentially limited and is practically impossible to either enter or leave it, and carry out such maneuvers is a real lottery. So while the map does not show that being completely cut off, they're saying, between the drone coverage and the direct fire coverage, it's essentially not possible for anyone to get in, probably pretty limited for people to get out. They say the battle for cities continues. At the moment, the defense forces are trying to exhaust the enemy's resources, primarily by using drones against him, but the Russians still have enough forces to carry out an uninterrupted rush of infantry into the city. And in today's report, we've got a lot of mixed data, right? We've got some people saying the Ukrainian or the Russian attacks are continuing, others saying that they're starting to die off. Maybe it's just different sectors of the same front seeing a little bit something different. But in terms of that continued rush of infantry, we've got a new Ukrainian goal, maybe is the right way to put it, where their new defense minister, Fedorov, said they aim to kill 50,000 Russian soldiers a month. Reporting in the Kyiv Independent said, quote, last month, 35,000 were killed. All of these losses are verified on video. And this is Fedorov. If we reach 50,000, we will see what happens to the enemy. They view people as a resource, and shortages are already evident. And he's correct. 50,000 is a wild number, by the way. And that, to my understanding, is not 50,000 killed, but 50,000 irrevocable losses, or irrecoverable losses, excuse me. So either seriously wounded, lost a leg, lost an arm, something like that, or killed. So they cannot re-enter the military and carry on combat operations. 50,000 a month is insane. Like, that is a wild number. And the fact that he said they've already clocked 35,000 a month is wild in the first place. Again, documented on video, right? So this is, they're doing a pretty good job of verifying these losses. Now, the challenge there is Russia doesn't seem to be changing their tactics at all. In fact, this is something we talked about in an interview yesterday with Ryan O'Leary, previously the commander of Chosen Company in Ukraine, where he laid out kind of an idea of what Ukraine needs to do to better affect the war via drones in 2026. And I'll link that in the description. But long story short, he's saying it's not a matter of killing Russians. If you're knocking out 20, 30, 40,000 a month, and that's not stopping recruitment. Now, there are some signs that recruitment has been affected to a degree, but Russia hasn't even mobilized at this point. They do have a lot of manpower they still could tap into. If 50,000 is not going to do it, what's it going to require? 60, 70, 80, 90, 100,000 a month? Ryan's thesis that I think is pretty valid is there needs to be an adjustment in what is targeted. And instead of just going after the oil refineries deep and the soldiers on the zero line, there are a lot of targets in the middle ground there, air defense and logistics, that can be and should be targeted with kind of medium-range strike drones. So between 40 to 150 kilometer range, we'll call it. And in his opinion, that's enough to actually really impact the course of the war in the very near future. So again, interesting interview. I think I learned a lot talking to Ryan. We'll have that linked in the description below. All right, so shifting over to Kupiansk, we got some new footage here coming out of Hartia Brigade showing the search and strike group of Charter, 4th Battalion Charter, carrying out operations in the city center. Not a lot of updates when it comes to Kupiansk. It looks like the few Russians that are still inside the city are holding on. Does look like Russia has surged some drone units to the outskirts of the city to try to essentially resupply and keep those few soldiers in Kupiansk alive. I've not seen any movement on the Russian side of trying to recapture any territory, and it looks like Ukraine is just trying to kind of slowly but surely reduce those pockets as best as possible. But overall, not a lot of change in Kupiansk. All right, then turning over to the Russian assessment, if you will. We've got two majors here, and I wanted to run through a couple of these. We're not going to get too in-depth, but just to give you an idea of how little updates are coming from the Russian side right now. I mean, we've got the long-range strikes, and we'll talk about those in a minute, into Ukraine, specifically targeting Ukrainian energy infrastructure, and then the very tactical fight of charging infantry against Ukrainian lines and getting killed by drones. But between that, talking about like territorial control or any real changes in the battlefield, from the Russian perspective, there just hasn't been any in a while. This assessment from two majors is kind of what we're seeing day in and day out for, weeks at this point. He talks about 12 drones being shot down over Russian territory. He does fortunately move kind of north to south, so it's easy to follow this. But he says, in Sumy, the North group of forces is engaged in battles. What? And that's kind of the theme, right? I'm not going to run through every single one of these, but he says, in Belgorod, a Ukrainian drone hit a car. Like, you understand how big this war is, and these are the type of updates that Russia is providing. In Kupiansk, major one, right? Battles continue. All right? That's it for the update. West of Pokrovsk, battles are taking place near Hershny. In Zaporizhia front, battles are taking place in Primorsk. In the Orhiv front, the situation remains unchanged. Like that, those are the updates. And two majors, for what it's worth, generally provides pretty detailed, in-depth analysis of multiple battles. And when there's a serious fight going on, he tends to be a relatively reliable source to look to at least get an idea of, if nothing else, the Russian perspective of the territory they're taking or the losses that they are inflicting. But for weeks now, it has just been this very tepid situation remains unchanged, or battles are taking place. And we're getting a lot more updates from the Ukrainian side than the Russian right now, especially when looking at actual situation on the ground. Now, I mentioned there's kind of this gap that we're seeing where a lot of the Russian advances are these infantry and small units moving towards the front, getting hit with Ukrainian drones, and Russia seems more focused on the deep strikes into Ukrainian territory. Overnight, there was a strike targeting Kharkiv and Kyiv. We know multiple locations were hit. Ukrainian President Zelensky put out a note saying, quote, "During the night, Russia massively attacked our regions. They launched over 370 strike drones and 21 missiles of various types. Kyiv and its region, Sumy, Kharkiv, and Chernihiv were targeted. In Kharkiv, a maternity hospital, a dormitory where displaced people lived, a medical college, and a residential building were damaged. He says, as of now, there were reports of dozens of people injured. I've seen north of 30 at this point, including a child. My understanding is 2 people were killed in these strikes as well. He says, in the capital and the region, the main target of the Russian strikes was the energy sector. And this is a tactic that is pretty devastating right now in Ukraine. Like, there's no two ways about it. They are freezing out the Ukrainian population, right? It's kind of an interesting difference here. We're seeing the Russian soldiers genuinely freezing to death trying to assault Ukrainian positions at the front. It's warfare, right? Meanwhile, Russia is conducting strikes inside of Ukraine, knocking out the energy infrastructure, trying to freeze the population out. And we've had, been fortunate this last week to have multiple interviews with people in Ukraine, and their electricity's on and off throughout the day. And just think about what it's like in a, when the electricity goes out, the heating goes out, right? So imagine even if you've got electricity for half of the day, trying to keep your place warm and livable all day in 0-degree weather, freezing conditions. That is the current strategy being laid out by Russia, is trying to freeze out the Ukrainian population in this, what is turning out to be one of the coldest, nastiest winters that has been seen in Ukraine in quite a while. So these deep strikes being carried out by Russia are very real. They're having a very real impact. And look, the longer these go on, the more and more devastating the effects will be. It's just, you can replace and repair some of this infrastructure, but if it gets hit the very next day or 2 days later or 3 days later, the problems kind of compound, and it gets to the point where eventually it's not repairable, at least in any short period of time. And if a large section of Kyiv right now is without power for multiple days, weeks maybe, it becomes uninhabitable. And that appears to be Russia's strategy as this winter drags on. But that's all we got for now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.